Hey y'all, how we doing? Shout out once again to Bear Nation for tuning in to another episode of the Bear Necessities podcast. I am your host, Rob Napoli. The Bear Necessities is a podcast where we sit down with entrepreneurs, ecosystem partners, and innovation folks to talk about what it takes and means to launch, create, and scale business across the world. We talk about the journey and the challenges of being entrepreneurial-minded and how that translates into your journey, giving you the tools and knowledge to overcome challenges that you may be facing in your life's journey. The Bear Necessities is part of the Rise Up Media family, and we thank you for tuning in. Now, let's get into the show. If you hadn't already heard about it, or you don't already know, my new book, The Social Soul, How to Master Your Personal and Professional Brand with Intentionality and Authenticity, is out now. You can find it on Barnes & Noble or Amazon. Go check it out, purchase a copy, let me know what you think, leave me a review. I appreciate y'all for the support. Can't wait to hear from you what stood out the most. How we doing, y'all? We are back again for another episode of the Bear Necessities podcast. I'm your host, Rob Napoli, and I am excited. I just got done having our kind of pre-chat in the call, which went way long because we just were rapping about a lot of things, but I've been wanting to have this guy on my podcast for a long time, Matt Hooper. I met Matt a few years ago in the ecosystem here in New York, and we've always kind of orbited around each other in a number of ways and connected, but we never had a chance to fully sit down. And we finally had that opportunity a while back, and I finally got him on the podcast. So I'm excited to have Matt Hooper on Bear Nation for y'all. This is going to be a wild episode. Give you a little context. Matt is a writer, teacher, podcaster, which we'll talk about that because there's some real inspiration from his podcast, and corporate innovator. He is now the Managing Director of IDONEA US, the American arm of the Danish management consultancy. Previously, though, he was the founder of LFT Media, a company that developed and produced corporate innovation stories for startup audiences. Clients included IBM, Google, Republic, Cast Software. And prior to this, Hooper was the first VP of Open Innovation at Barclays, where he launched Rise New York, the model for Barclays' global innovation programs. He's also a facilitator at the Sci Center for Innovative Thinking at Yale, where he co-created the Innovation from the Inside Intensive. That is a lot. Matt, thank you for being a part of Bear Nation. Say hi to Bear Nation for me.
Hi, Bear Nation. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for having me, Rob. That was wild. I feel like when someone reads something like that about you, you kind of think like, am I dead? You know what I mean? That's a lot of stuff. Thank you. Thank you, man.
Absolutely. And I appreciate having you. And, it's fun. It's fun to be able to read that out loud and give that as context, because the world has so much opportunity to grow and scale. And, I talk on this podcast a lot about nonlinear career paths and letting and following what can be. And I think your background is a great tale about and we'll talk about this throughout this podcast, a strive for what innovation is and a strive for creating innovation and how that's threaded through all these different opportunities, which do kind of tie together, but it's never been linear, and it's kind of all over the place. And you've had some amazing experiences traveling the world, and I can't wait to dive in. But I want to start with the beginning, because you have an entrepreneurial background. You did start some businesses kind of before going the corporate route. And tell me a little bit about, what does entrepreneurship mean to you, and what drew you to the idea of entrepreneurship to start in your career, in your life?
Well, first of all, thank you, because I think the nonlinear thing is relevant for a lot of people, particularly younger people now coming out of school or grad school. I think a lot of my decisions were like shaped outside of my control, especially when I was younger.
Yeah.
I listened. Mike Birbiglia has a great podcast, The Comedian, and he had a really interesting interview with Bill Hader, the writer and comedian, and they were talking about. And it's funny, I'm 33 and I feel like I just heard this. Like, this was something I'd never heard before, but they were talking about the best stories usually involve narratives where the rule becomes so then, not and then. Like, you could tell a story sucks, or it's a movie, a TV show, a book, whatever. if it feels kind of random, if the connections between different plot points are like, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. But so then is causal, right? One decision was made, so then another, and these things built upon each other. I feel like my career has been so then. And as a consequence, and it continues to be, like, I did one thing that led to another thing. It's a so then sort of career. And I also encourage that kind of thinking, that kind of framework. A lot of people live and work and then sort of structure. Right. These things happened to, and I didn't really take advantage of the opportunity. That's and then. I look at it as a lot of things happened around me and then shaped me. So then I made decisions. So when I was a junior in college, the economy collapsed. I mean, I said I'm 33. This is, what year is this? 2022? Yeah. Where the hell am I? So 2022. So in 2008, I was living in Brooklyn, and I went to NYU, and the economy collapsed. And I was very confident, like too confident through college, that I was going to be a writer and filmmaker. That was my. I don't know that I thought it was my calling. I found, like a lot of people, especially back then, movies were a way to see the world. I mean, this is again like pre-ubiquitous internet. I used to get DVDs at Blockbuster or watch them at home, and then before that, it was the VHS. I mean, right? Like, what that was like.
And I graduated just a year ahead of you, so
that's my point exactly. What was up. I mean, the way that you interacted with the world, particularly if, like me, I lived in a suburb of New York City, so I was close to the action, whatever that meant. But when you're a kid, no, there is no action. Like it's my bicycle, my dog, my toys, whatever, the same stuff we all have. So I didn't think there was another way to see the world or be involved in the world except to make videos. Like that was my way in. I was filming bar and bat mitzvahs for money when I was younger than the kids getting bar and bat mitzvah. I mean, I was 12, they were 13, or I was 11, they were 13, whatever. And it was like a hustle. And I had a company that is actually still a company. I've incorporated it as an adult just to keep the name. But when I was young, it was called Spinning Bear Productions because a friend of mine had a stuffed teddy bear. I had a stuffed teddy bear, and he took it. He used to spin it in front of a performance of like a play or a video we would do. It was like the logo at the beginning.
Yeah.
And so Spinning Bear Productions was my first entrepreneurial endeavor.
I love the bear theme.
I was the bear thing, right? Yeah. The overlap
makes me happy.
And so, and then when College Dropout came out and Kanye had the bear thing, I was like, oh, I'm in good company. So anyway, that's the first entrepreneurial thing I ever did, was like in high school and middle school. And it was a way to sort of get all my friends to get together on the weekends, but also to make something. We were making videos, and I was learning how to edit. I edited on sort of primitive video editing software, like this thing called Casablanca, which no one even remembers. I had to edit on VHS tapes, and something called an early Adobe program. And then iMovie came along on the first iMacs. It was native to those computers. And so that changed everything. And I moved on from high tape to mini DV tape. And so the sort of two sides of my brain, the one that liked techie stuff, like making stuff, and the storytelling side, were always kind of communicating that way. I mean, I wasn't aware of that at the time, but I look back / like in therapy, I think that makes the connection for me. Yeah. So again, all that happened by the time I'm 20. So I'm completely convinced that I'm going to enter show business in some way. And then, things go south. Truthfully, the thing I wanted the most to do was make like a mid-budget movie, literally the kind of movie they do not make anymore, unless maybe it's on Netflix. Like if you asked me what inspired me all throughout high school, I would have said, when I saw 21 Grams, or when I would rewatch obsessively Spike Lee's He Got Game, or 25th Hour, or the films of Charlie Kaufman. Like I was sort of an aesthete, pretentious viewer as a teen. And so when I was in college and I went to NYU, I didn't go to film school, and that also was an opportunity to see sort of more of the world. But I think that between deep job insecurity, no real sense that the kind of film I'd ever want to make would be made again. And by the way, it isn't. I was prescient about that. With the death of the home video market, they don't make movies like that. You're not going to make a Good Will Hunting. For economic reasons. you'll make 20 Marvel movies, which I love. I love Marvel movies, but I'm just saying it's a very different thing. And so coming out of college, a friend of mine and I were talking about how all the attention that was happening in media was happening on your phone. And what if we built a mobile app company? We had a really good idea for an app. I had no idea to run an app company. We raised money from friends and family. One of the people who had committed dropped out, which created enormous pressure. We almost raised a second round of funding, like real venture funding. It was so exciting. I learned the entire world of early stage fundraising, changed my identity completely, became obsessed with making this app. That also fell apart. And so I spent basically a year not launching a business. And then we made a second app. It didn't work either. And then in the summer of 2012, we wound down the business and I was miserable. And I was also 24, which meant that I thought that I was old. I was like, I'm done. My career's over. I don't want to do it. And then I was hired by a really interesting team of folks who had built the Farmville I think just the Frontierville product at Zynga. They launched a product studio in New York. And I got to be honest that even though I wasn't there for very long, that role kept me from, I got into but did not go to grad school. I, during that time, had a little more stability in my life and I met the woman who's now my wife. I sort of redesigned my life around, how do I put this? Instead of being pissed off at what didn't happen in college and sort of waxing nostalgic about how, like the same energy I brought to like high school videos wasn't happening in my career, or this stupid economy, no one can get a job anywhere. Like I wasn't even hired at MTV, like whatever the things I thought could happen, right? Instead of being pissed off about that, I instead felt right at home, and this is gonna sound so silly, as a failed entrepreneur. We thought we were gonna have an exit, we didn't have one. I mean, the whole thing, in a community of people who took risks. So that's a very long answer to how I started, but I feel like the way I started is entirely part of the decision to not be a filmmaker and the decision to like lean into the failure instead of front like it worked. You know what I mean? Or like pretend like it, like my experience was the only one, because once there was about a year and a half of my life where any given night you'd find me at a bar in Soho with a bunch of other people who had failed. Yeah. And that was the most reassuring sort of cultural experience I'd ever had. People who had swung for the fences, had the $100 million valuation, had it all fall apart, and got it the next day and did it again. Yeah. And I'm a naturally competitive person. I'm a person that also enjoys camaraderie. Yeah. And so to be around sort of like-minded people was it just changed my life. And I've been in that world ever since.
And I love that because, for me, as I was kind of telling you pre-show, is I didn't fall into this idea of entrepreneurship until way later in life, right? Yeah. I grew up in the Midwest. I went to college to play football. Afterwards, I wasn't sure what to do. Like I grew up at the same time, financial crisis. Like I knew that it had an effect, but I didn't really know what it meant. And there's a lot of things that had to happen. And we talk about nonlinear career pathing that had happened to me from the first job I took in recruiting for like speech pathologists, occupational therapists for hospitals. This is 2010. I was given a phone and a box of resumes and a fax machine. I would literally like highlight things on a piece of paper, fax it on top of the resume, and send them off to hospitals and picking up the phone all the time. And I watched my training video was from 1985, and I was born in 87.
Yeah, and I remember that time. It was weird because that was when New York started. Like, because I was in New York, obviously, and so the reason we knew the recession had hit so badly was Wall Street. Like all of a sudden, people who used to have all the money and power in the world, unfairly, I mean, I'm not saying they just were suddenly like vaguely unemployed. I mean, it was at first in New York experienced as a white collar crisis. Yeah. The rest of the country did not bounce back as quickly, and it led to the decade and a half of tumult we still have. I mean, we can go on and on about how I think that the bailout was lacking, but the anger in New York, which led to the Occupy movement, which also started in Lower Manhattan just a year later, was based on like people actually just losing their jobs. Yeah, like it was the most concise version of that. So who did those? So what happened to a lot of those people? They became angel investors. They became early stage venture capitalists. When I was 23 going to raise money, every slightly older person had a "Where were you on 9/11" story. Yeah, I was in 8th grade. So my story was, while vivid and scary, not their story, which was I was in, one of the towers.
Yeah.
So I know what you mean, that like sort of legacy of a different kind of business world still hung over that era.
Mm-hmm.
You're getting training videos from the mid 80s. I'm meeting largely overcapitalized white men who had come of age in like the boom years.
Yeah.
Gotten a Wall Street gig in the late 80s, early 90s, never really lost it, but survived, obviously the great terror attack of our age in New York. And it was interesting to feel like, and this is sort of a weird thing to say, but I feel like this happens a lot in innovation and in a way that doesn't happen in other careers. I feel like history is constantly kind of gnawing at you. Like, I mean, full disclosure, right? You and I are recording this on a day where, for much of the conversation we had going into this, is that Russia has attacked Ukraine. And we each know and have relationships with Ukrainian startups. So in this kind of work, you're very connected to the world. Yeah. And that was another, so like, again, the so then thing, not and then.
Yeah.
Stuff happens in the world, so then you make decisions. That is always how I have felt. I did not, this is so cheesy, but like, I didn't choose to be in the innovation ecosystem. It chose me. It's very clear looking back, that's what happened.
Yeah, and that's what I think is really unique about when we think about entrepreneurship, and we think about how people find and define what entrepreneurship is to them and starting a business, that happens at different stages of life. And it's part of the consequence of where you grew up and the opportunities you were exposed to and those things. And so having that opportunity to be exposed in that New York ecosystem, NYU, those things versus small town Iowa, and the different trajectories allows for, so then different paths to where we are today can happen. And I think it's really easy. You know what? You and I both, well, my audience knows I'm very competitive, and you also brought up that you're competitive. We tend to want to compete with what the world is. And
to that end, I'm doing a better job on this show than you. I just want to let you.
Hey, always. I love it. And so this competitiveness is that we're competing against all these other things versus what does that mean for me and how do I compete with myself and grow? And that's why I think every story is so impressive, because it's theirs and their vision. And it's part of where this whole podcast was born out of, is everyone has a different way of how they fell into wanting to start something and build something. And it's part of where the way you're raised up in entrepreneurship or the way you fell into it later in life. And I think that's so unique. Sometimes my family like loves what I do and they're proud of me, but they're kind of like, don't you want something more stable? Like a salary and benefits? I'm like, I kind of love not knowing and fucking.
The whole thing is so exciting, Rob, but like, 401ks are exciting too.
they are. And, I almost took a job in a financial firm. And so I have I was smart and invested early, and created some IRAs and mutual funds, that allowed me to do some of this stuff. So, and I always tell people, yeah, I know that's there. But the thing is, I can go get a job anywhere. I know I have those skills, but I want to do this now. And what if it fails? So then I go get another job and I learn from this. And I love that idea of so then versus and then. Just you saying that is just like an instant like story switch, right? And it just makes things kind of grow into it. And so then for you, you had this company, you had these failed experiences, you were in New York City with all these people and learning and having this kind of opportunity to rebound, refocus, and regrind. And you started kind of falling into some entrepreneur in residence, and you launched into really what kind of happened with the opportunity at Barclays. So what was that transition? You're going through New York, you're feeling all this out.
You're sort of vagabonding around. Yeah. I mean, I think
what happened to the next step into, I'm going to take this and learn from it.
The real, the long answer is I didn't ever think I'd work at a large corporation. I don't know why I said the long answer. That's the same. It's not a very long answer. I didn't think that was going to happen. What happened was a dear friend of mine and I, Dimitri Kavaros, who's now at Silicon Valley Bank and had been my co-founder also at a time after this, and still one of my dearest friends. He and I had the opportunity to run the Startup Next program for Up Global, which was a pre-accelerator. This was like you were too early to get into Y Combinator, Techstars, Entrepreneurs Roundtable Accelerator. Where do you go?
Yeah.
And they were looking for someone to run it in New York. It was part-time. I was working on an interactive video application that I actually spoke about on the panel at South by Southwest. Like I was very into doing that. I was thinking about, I had done a couple of different, so I was always still into video and still into sort of that what media could do, but it was to communicate entrepreneurial ideas, which later I made a career. At the time I was struggling with a little bit. And I had like enough money to survive, but not to thrive. So I should point out at this time I was living a very small life. And for any entrepreneur out there, I think it's very important to note that I was living with my girlfriend, her sister, and 2 other roommates in one apartment. And I was like turning 27 or something. So I felt very, I don't know. I didn't feel bad about it, but I look back and I think like, that was probably a lot of stress. Like, I don't think I really internalized, right? So I get, and I was also working at the first WeWork location on 154 Grand, which Adam Newman had opened when he left, he sold another co-working space. It was the first location in New York. So WeWork was like the spot where you would find, I mean, I don't want to like blow up anybody's spot, but like what you used to do is you like went to an event, got free dinner, got a couple of beers, watched whatever the talk was, pointed at on stage and was like, wow, Fred Wilson or whatever, whoever the new celebrity in New York was at that time, and then left. I didn't do this. I was a member. I'm very proud of that. But I will say that like there was a culture of that. So, in terms of, again, so then just being in the right place at the right time, like I was sort of like Zelig or Forrest Gump or something for the entrepreneurial scene. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like if they went through New York, I met them at one point because between sort of Canal Street, but really like, I would say between Canal Street and Houston Street, like east of West Broadway, west of maybe like Mott, one of those, I'm going to get my Nolita geography screwed up right now, but like a very small area of Manhattan, so many co-working spaces, so many like people who would like, walk out of the Gawker office and go to drinks, or walk out of the sort of larger offices there on Lower Broadway, where they had a lot of like Lair Ventures backed startups would come out of there. And it just became like an actual neighborhood. And then when I was living in Park Slope, I was like 1 or 2 stops away on the N train. So to like, again, when listening, like you want to hustle, you want to be out there, and it's harder during the pandemic. I get it. Put a mask on, go to the event. Like do it. It makes a big difference. And that changed my life also, was just being available. And I would say that so there's probably 2 things. One is I was probably coping because I didn't want to be in that apartment with all those people. But I stayed out very late meeting. Sorry, I didn't mean to hit the microphone. I'll try that again. So I stayed out very late meeting some of the most exciting entrepreneurs of the moment. And so by the time I got to manage Startup Next, I know I'm kind of rambling here and I apologize for that. But by the time I got to manage Startup Next, I was just trying to fill in those 4 years. I knew a lot about launching products that worked and didn't. I knew a lot about what I was good at as an entrepreneur and what I wasn't. And then what I wasn't, I was learning from other people, like going to grad school at night by just interviewing people. I said I was going to be hosting a talk show as a web series, which I may have done. I wanted to. I didn't know if it was going to happen, just to interview people over lunch. So I could ask them questions. It's like you find the excuse, you find the way that you want to, how do other people think? So anyway, by the time I got to Startup Next, the truth is I had launched 1.5 things. Some stuff had gone well. One project, my first company, really hadn't. But I found that I loved working with founders, and I was sort of prepared to do that forever. Up Global was acquired by Techstars. There were a couple of other accelerator roles. And one of the things that was happening at the time was the Barclays accelerator, which was run by Techstars back then, was opening in New York. And in addition to opening the accelerator, they were opening a co-working space called Rise, which would be sort of a fintech-focused WeWork. And someone had to do a job that was essentially help support the accelerator, although over time that became less of the job, get members going in this co-working space, this big, beautiful space on 23rd Street between 5th and 6th Avenue. And also build what would later become known as like an intrapreneurial program. I was uniquely skilled at those things. I mean, you know what I mean? Again, like you just realize what you have. I think at the time I still fancied myself something of a novice. I don't know that I thought I was good at that, but I had a manager that really did.
Yeah.
And he encouraged me and hired me. And it was some days I feel like it was my most successful startup. I'm doing an event right now with Rise, which is the name of the co-working space open, like, because it was so misunderstood at first. And then within a few months of my being there, it was like the spot to go to in New York.
Yeah.
But what it also was, and this is a good transition to, I know probably other questions that you're going to have, like, it was and I give enormous credit to Arian Lewis, who is now the CEO of Kiln, who was my manager there, and to Derek White, who was the chief design officer at Barclays when I first started. They're both now in Utah, but they were in London and New York respectively when I was doing it. The thing that they wanted to do was build a place where corporates and startups could work together.
Mm-hmm.
And that was 7 years ago. And for the last 7 years of my life, my career has been seeing if I can get corporates and startups to work together.
Yeah.
So I give them enormous credit for and that whole team. I mean, the whole Barclays team, like, they did a really amazing thing. And I don't know that I fully recognized it even until years later, but the idea that our generation of people who were hustling, I mean, really hustling, as I've described, right?
Yeah.
Like bouncing between co-working spaces, hoping that they get enough traction, living on debt, praying that a big VC would show them just a glimpse of attention. You know, I often joke that, like, because it was so hard to afford $2,000 a month in Brooklyn, you may as well become a billionaire.
Yeah.
Like that was the ethos.
Mm-hmm.
And we're seeing some of that come in Web3 right now, which I don't think is healthy, but we can get to that. But the idea that a large institution, in the case of Barclays at the time, it was 325 years old.
Yeah.
That they could shine a light on you, a startup, and that they could maybe learn from you. That was a big thing.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't just validating to me and to other fintech. I wasn't a fintech entrepreneur, but to other entrepreneurs, specifically fintech entrepreneurs,
mm-hmm.
which was important. It was a recognition that institutions have something to learn,
mm-hmm.
and a recognition to entrepreneurs that they have something to teach and something to learn. It was a two-way relationship. But that relationship has been the basis of my career for the last 7 years. But I didn't even know it was possible
mm-hmm.
until we opened up that space. And it was just a very it was a very inspiring time in my career.
Yeah. Well, you made a great point, and it's something I talk about in my book, The Social Soul, and I preach this all the time, is value-added network. And what does that actually mean? And you kind of talked about it. You went to all these events. You were available. When you have opportunity, you need to go step into it, even if it's uncomfortable. Meet people, right? Understanding that is one of your most powerful things, is to have a strong network of people, and putting yourself out there and going to meet them and creating opportunities to do that and have conversations is huge. And that opens up so many doors, and we're all so afraid to take that step. And I talk about it a lot, is just how to go out doing that. And you can do it and even during a pandemic. And some of the people on my board of advisors, some of the people that I trust a lot, I've never met in real life, that I've met over the last 2.5 years. And, at this time when you're going through Startup Next, it was the time that I moved to Milan. And when I had moved to Milan and was in Italy, I was starting to realize I had picked myself out of being in the Midwest, growing up in Kansas City, Des Moines. And now I'm starting to have this global ecosystem and starting to realize how wide the world is, but also how small it can be.
No, I know
the value of that.
It's funny you say that, because obviously Barclays was international, but I had the pleasure and privilege of being able to live abroad for much of a year in college.
Mm-hmm.
I did basically half a year in London and then a summer program in Florence. So, it was much of 2007 and 2008 that year. And that was my first time. Also, I was younger, I was 19 and turning 20. So I think, but I know what you're talking about, that moment where you're like, whoa, the world is so big and there are so many people in it, mm-hmm. and they all don't know you. And they have many different opinions and many different views. You instantly find commonality. Like, that is the goal. You don't find like-mindedness necessarily, and you don't find consensus. I think this is the great cultural misunderstanding of our time. People don't have to agree with you.
Yeah.
We have to find commonality.
Yes.
And the more siloed we become, and the more time we spend online, and the more time we spend away from other people, which is why I think it's so important you're saying, even if it's virtual, talk to someone, because it is hard to see people in person right now. I get it. It really matters. The most depressing experiences I've had in my career are when a lot of people think a certain way, and so as a consequence won't do something risky. Whether that means hiring a new employee, sometimes that meant hiring me, sometimes it meant hiring someone else, sometimes I couldn't make the hire. That's one way of not taking a risk. Investing in something when it looks good, but you haven't done it traditionally, so you don't want to do it. Opening a new branch, whatever it is, the aversion to risk comes out of, I think, this belief that I think the aversion to risk is often discussed as something that, like, if it hasn't worked before, it won't work now, so it's fear. I don't know if that's the actual diagnosis. I think it's the belief that, like, well, we all agree this is stupid, right? We all agree that that we shouldn't be taking the risk. And people are too afraid to speak up the fact they don't agree. That's been my experience. It's not that people like are proud of any kind of tradition. I don't think anyone really cares about that stuff. I think that when people, especially in business, make decisions that often look short-sighted or risk averse, it's because they think everyone's going to agree with them. And no one speaks up. And the difference between commonality and agreement is, like, it's really important. There's so many times where I've lost fights or won fights and no one agreed. But we found a common issue that bonded us, that allowed us to work together, and something got done. And I often don't hear that I don't often hear that distinction, but it's a very important one. And if you want to be an entrepreneur, or in the case of Barclays, as a corporate innovator, which is intrapreneurial, but not entrepreneurial, if you want to do that work, there's so much advice to be an entrepreneur now. Like, there's so many books and there are all these things and it's all these best practices. But the truth is, and I'm going to swear a little bit, don't be a jerk. That's the real idea. Don't be a jerk. That seems to be the thing I don't often hear enough in advice given to entrepreneurs. And if you are not a jerk, you will find that you can create commonality, discover commonality on a group of people, even if you don't find agreement.
Absolutely. And I love that. And it's such a powerful piece. And that's why I think so much around this idea of innovation, and especially when you start talking about entrepreneur, and I had Greg Larkin on and we talked about entrepreneurship, and it was an amazing
Greg is
episode.
A friend of mine. He's one of the most interesting guys I know, and everyone should read his book, and he's just brilliant. He
is. And he's so much fun to talk to. We talk a lot about what entrepreneurship means. And
he's also got great taste in music. I hope you all talked about music. When I saw Greg last in person, we just talked about music.
That's tends to be the case. Him and I actually went out to Rockaway one day and went out for lunch, and he showed me where he grew up. And, while we were talking about all these things, sometimes a song would come on and he would take him back to a time and place. And then he would bring up this story we'd talk about. It was just so amazing to hear that. He's amazing. And so what I love about this is you had this kind of entrepreneurial spirit, knowing all these things, and then you stepped into this opportunity at Rise, and part of this is also you had people around you that pushed you and saw what you were good at and helped you take a swing at something that you didn't know you were good at, and you went into it, which led into the opportunity at Barclays to be the VP of Open Innovation. What was, as you kind of took that transition step in there, what was the biggest challenge for you to kind of leave the entrepreneurial space, the Rise space, and now you're doing entrepreneurship and innovation inside a big company? What was that? What was a major challenge that you stepped into as you walked in that door?
Yeah, I think patience. That's the big one. Patience. I was impatient. I was also 27.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? I think a lot of this is age. Like, I think, like, politically, this is not where I am. I'm a big fan of smart policy being a good idea and making good decisions. I don't have a libertarian streak.
Mm-hmm.
But the move fast and break things, disrupt or be disrupted ethos was one that I adopted.
Yeah.
Right. So again, like, not in my personal life, not in the way I thought about things, but like the way I worked, that was it. So someone will be like, we can't do that, or it's not compliant or whatever. My actual gut reaction was like, they're wrong. That's not true. I don't think they were wrong.
Yeah.
But the knee jerk, real knee jerk to the point of like self-censorship, because I'd otherwise, declare I don't agree, was frustration with bureaucracy.
Mm-hmm.
And that once I got over that, I found more success there, like sold more memberships, got more senior stakeholders to care, this is a big one, ensured that there was more support for the actual innovative programs itself. And like, getting senior MD managing directors to commit to actually showing up at the selection day for the accelerator, basic stuff that sort of is almost politics in an organization like that.
Yeah.
You get better at making that happen and finding those allies, the more you recognize that you just have to be a bit more patient. That was the first one. The other was process. Mm-hmm. When you hustle, you have no process.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I got to get paid. That's the process.
Yeah. Quickest path to getting the money in the bank.
Yeah, exactly. Process is I need money. And I was thinking about that. That was the way I thought. And so so to be respectful of larger processes and longer processes, just an incredible lesson. And then I was able to build a whole business where I was like always going through procurement. You know what I mean? Like I saw the problems firsthand.
Yeah.
And it's again, but I just didn't know. I just didn't know. And there are a lot of really exciting companies that do really innovative and interesting things. I mean, like SAP is an example of that, but it's so much smaller. Like Barclays was so big.
Yeah.
It's hard to even explain the size of that organization.
Yeah.
Right. And or the age of it. Again, it was founded in 1690.
Yeah.
There are many parts throughout the UK where the word Barclays is synonymous with the word bank, like Xerox and photocopier. It had a place in people's minds and in hearts. My father's parents are no longer with us, but my dad is from Birmingham, England, and his parents are too. And shocker, also from Birmingham, England. And they were like 10 years older than my mom's parents. So they were sort of from an actual different era.
Yeah.
And they were my granddad was in the Royal Navy, and like a lot of Britons, their age and class and interest, World War II was the seminal event. If not overtly royalist, they had enormous respect for the crown. I mean, they were like old school is a generous way of putting it. And when I saw a lot of who Barclays actually served on the retail side, because I reported into the investment bank, right? That was the U.S. business. Mm-hmm. I sort of saw my dad's parents. I saw my grandparents. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? I saw that's who ultimately the bank had been serving.
Yeah.
And so talk about patience and process, like good luck telling them about Venmo, let alone, what kind of crypto they should be buying. And so that was another real learning curve for me, was recognizing, and by the way, this was part of the culture. I mean, like I worked at a British bank during Brexit.
Yeah.
This was again, this whole like world historical events happen to you.
Yeah.
The idea of who those older customers were or who we were building for, who the young customers were, that has a different context.
Yeah.
And a society that has decided suddenly that Britain means something different than it did a day before.
Yeah.
So you had to learn how to walk and chew gum in a very different way as an intrapreneur than as an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
I have a friend that likes to say, I hear him on podcasts sometimes, and he's got a good line, which I kind of like sometimes. Sometimes I like it, which is like, there's no such thing as an intrapreneur.
Yeah.
To which I always think, you're wrong. You just didn't do it.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's one of those like gotcha lines, but I think in reality, of course there's an intrapreneur. And he and I have joked about this a lot. I mean, he knows that I have this opinion. But it's like, I have come to find that the hard work of innovating at scale within an existing legacy institution is so much more interesting and so much more difficult. And I didn't even feel that way while I was at Barclays. Like I had to age into that philosophy.
Yeah.
So I would say that patience and process were the big things. But to anyone out there who's listening or is thinking about joining a corporate and is currently at a startup or blah, 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 like that doesn't happen overnight. Like that is a long realization. I would say that I had that thought in 2015, and in like 2019, like, the coin dropped. Like it took a while.
Yeah. I mean, I did something similar. And when I moved back to the States and came to New York, I spent the first 4 months going through an accelerator, working for a startup. Unfortunately, things didn't happen where they could
What
keep me
accelerator
on.
did you work for? I don't know this.
I went through Venture Out.
Gotcha.
And so that's where I met Phil DeVecchio, who became my co-founder at Hapte Group. And so I did this for 4 months. And when we got done through it, we were going through a raise and all these things. And, the company decided U.S. expansion needed to wait. And I didn't want to move back to Italy, and I couldn't live in New York on an Italian salary. So we parted ways, and I went into a large global recruiting firm called Michael Page, British company, and suit and tie, Midtown. And in those 18 months, I learned a lot. It was the first time, I'd worked for Kforce, a large national recruiting firm, but I worked in a Midwest office. So I had a lot of autonomy and it was much more laid back. So to kind of first step into a true global corporate and work and grow, those are a lot of things that I had to learn very quickly, is how to slow down a little bit, how to read the room, how to build through, and where to go to get things done. Because it wasn't as easy as just go do it. Right. And so I think that's, and I share this with people always like startup or corporate. I'm like, if you have the opportunity to go do both, I think that having that experience gives you a lot of visibility.
And they provide very different things. I'm from a family where no one ever worked in a corporation. I mean, my time at Barclays was the first time anybody in my entire family worked at a corporation, and all the generations of people that I'm aware of. Not like, in terms of like actual direct genealogical, like someone might have married into, a guy or gal that worked at a corporate, but it was not necessarily a career option that I was aware of.
Yeah.
So it was also helpful for me just in that way. Like, this is how the majority of the information economy goes to work. They put on a suit, they go into an office, and they send emails.
Yeah.
That is
and they send meetings.
It's a big, I often joke that we're all professional emailers. Like, this is a big part of the way people work.
Yeah.
Within that work, you can change the world. And that's the part I wasn't always aware of.
Yeah.
Like the satirical part, I got.
Yeah.
I got it, but the part where you can actually change the world because you have institutional trust, you have legacy, you have relationships, that blew my mind and has inspired me clearly ever since. And I'm happy to talk about what that actually means. Like, I hope I'm not speaking so abstractly, but like, I guess what I'm trying to say is I was a guy who wasn't anti-corporate so much as didn't get it.
Yeah.
I didn't get it. Or some corporations, like I've done enormous amounts of work with IBM. I mentioned SAP earlier, like companies that are really big, but sort of technically based. They made sense to me because coming from tech.
Yeah.
But like a bank, my thought was, generationally speaking, my thought was, and everyone I knew thought this way, didn't the banks screw up the world? Like, weren't the banks part of the reason that we all had to make careers out of thin air and hustle in those WeWork offices and da-da-da-da? So it was interesting to see a bank as a platform for enormous innovation and not as a restrictive environment or something that would be sort of too sclerotic to support growth. Yeah.
And I appreciate you sharing that because that's something that I learned is that, and I talk about this when I hear the word entrepreneur or entrepreneurship, I think of two things. There's entrepreneur as a role and entrepreneurial as a mindset, right?
Totally.
And you can go into large corporates and take an entrepreneur mindset and see amazing things happen. In fact, I do training for large multinationals and I talk about these things. I see it happen and see great things that can happen. So that's why I tell people I'm not, startup versus corporate. It's like, go do both if you have the opportunity. Get those two sides of the exposure because you can learn so much that can help you make the change that you want to make because you can see both sides and you learn so many different skills. And that's why I think it's so important when I talk to people about career paths is like, it's okay to be nonlinear. It's okay not to have it figured out at 24 or 27 or 32 or 40. Like, you continue to grow and evolve.
Yeah. And also, like, who has a linear path anymore? I have one friend that has had the same job since after college. One, period.
Yeah. Oh, I have a lot. I mean, but that's, again, from the Midwest. I have a lot of friends. Like, I'm kind of the exception to that rule because there's not as much. When you get to a certain point, taking those risks change, right? And it also depends on.
But I feel like in an economy that is so unstable, that at least at the time we were coming out of school, that was. I mean, now there's so many jobs.
Yeah,
there are other problems, but there are many jobs. But at the time, that 2008, 2011, roughly, the recovery was slow and it was very difficult to hire. So I'm surprised you're hearing that many people found jobs. Maybe that's the other thing is I'm just remember the insecurity around finding a job.
Well, it was helpful that in Des Moines, Principal, Nationwide, Wells Fargo, a lot of big insurance institutions, and then the HARP Refi program kickstarted a lot. Like the Des Moines was the home for the HARP Refi, and it employed a lot of the city. And because of that, and then you have like
that's interesting. Iowa's so good at like those heritage businesses because doesn't John Deere do such great work?
John Deere's there. Yep.
Yeah.
John Deere's in Johnston, another big organization out there. So
I thought John Deere was in Dubuque.
They have a big campus in Johnston.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, but Dubuque is the home.
Also around that same time, what I'm saying is that there are large, like if you look at like the West Virginian economy at that time, tough. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you look, as I said, like sort of the entirety of Lower Manhattan, ghost town. Like there's pockets of the country that really hit. It's fascinating that Iowa, given the institutions, you're also making a really great argument for legacy institutions. Like because they're there, they're hiring. That's really interesting.
And Iowa, Des Moines is the second largest insurance city behind Hartford. Right?
Hartford, yeah. I live in Connecticut now, and I mean, I
so
don't live
you
near
know the Hartford. So like Des Moines had that, and what happened, and also what brought a lot of things to Iowa is Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft all have data centers because they can have large warehouse space, and you can keep it cool. The weather,
and Ray Kinsella built a baseball field in his farm. I don't know if and a bunch of ghosts started showing up. I don't know if you were there for that, but that was a big.
I will say the amount of my friends that went to that when that game actually happened, and the amount of stories, the people that went. What?
Last summer?
Last summer, yeah.
Yeah, that was like the best thing that ever happened to anyone I know. That was like the whole. I think the whole country cried that night.
Yeah, it was amazing. It was.
I made the mistake of watching it. It's so stupid. I watched it on my phone. I think in the middle of the night, and of course I'm like crying. Watching Kevin Costner come out of the cornfield, trying not to make noise because it's quiet. So yeah, it was probably the best day of my life was watching on that phone.
I love it, and it's such an experience, and so like that's why I kind of growing into that and seeing that, and one of the cool things that happened because I was recruiting for these large institutions like Nationwide, I was in some of those rooms where they talked about making the insurance business recession proof. And how do they do that? And where does innovation happen? And in terms of Nationwide Insurance, launching one of the first ever fully agile, 3 floors of fully agile implement. They ripped out all the cubes and made agile workspaces and did these really cool things. And that was actually the time in my career when I started to get that entrepreneurial bug of like, what is next for me? And starting to set off on a different course. So I love that this kind of, you got to see the side. And after Barclays, you founded LFT Media and got to do this really cool thing called Live from Tomorrow. And I want to get into that because for my listeners out there, I've been wanting to do a podcast since like 2015, 2016, never knew what to talk about, where to start. And during the pandemic, really, when Live from Tomorrow was playing, I was listening. So many things inspired me about that. That is the reason that I launched my podcast in the summer of last year. And it was taking from that idea of I want a place in a space to talk to amazing people, learn about them, tell their story, share insights, and hopefully create change in the way people think and do, and that there are opportunities out there that you can be entrepreneurial in any stage of your life. You can have a nonlinear career path and still make something, and you can take risks and chances to go challenge and change in whatever shape and form that may mean for you. So when you left Barclays and started LFT Media, what was that impetus and what really led to getting into the media game again and kind of going back to your roots of creating shows? Yeah,
it's funny you're saying that because so like I had never professionally worked in media, right? So like I also thought I was like going back to my roots, but of course I had like no experience, and I learned that the hard way in like my second week on the job. So Live from Tomorrow started as a meetup in the summer of 2015 with, again, myself and Dimitri Kavaros, with whom I ran Startup Next. In fact, the first Live from Tomorrow event we did, which was co-hosted with a friend of mine and produced by one of the founders in that Startup Next cohort, that first event. I'm trying to think when this was, July 2015. It was like, I've told this story on other podcasts because it was like the best founder story. We had this idea for taking our Startup Next cohort and instead of giving them a boring demo day, give them a cool demo day that's like also a late night variety show. Mm-hmm. Dimitri, my co-founder, again, is now at Silicon Valley Bank. Was at Newark Venture Partners for a while, was at WeWork. Like the dude, like me, has been a lot of startup-y places.
Yeah.
He's really funny. And like, that's a hard thing to find in this world. He's really funny.
Yeah.
And like very silly. Like used to come into my office at Rise and pretend to be afraid of everything. I know this sounds so dumb, but just the sort of courage of being able to walk into an office and then like do a bit and no one's really aware that you're doing a bit. It's sort of just for my amusement.
Yeah.
Like it made me love him even more. So we were good friends and collaborators and started next. We'd be like very serious, you know, in our gig together, which was a weekly event at that time because we were both still doing other things. And then Live from Tomorrow at LMHQ, Lower Manhattan headquarters, this big co-working space. We did the first event and it was a terrible storm and we sold 140 tickets. Mm-hmm. And we were like, oh, wow. You know, if we got 11 people showing up in this weather, we're lucky. And 137 people of the 140 came.
Wow.
And so we realized we had something, that this weird mixture of like comedy and tech was there. And then the show moved to Rise because very selfishly, when I helped open Rise, we needed people to come and events were helpful. Mm-hmm. So the event manager there asked if we could start bringing people in. I was like, great. Good lead generation. And so we started using the theater at Rise and we did a bunch of meetups there. And we brought in a great band, the Academy of Blues Project. And we started to like shape the show and it became a little less sort of talk showy, a little more variety showy. And a bunch of folks from IBM Blockchain came to an event in March of 2017. Mm-hmm. So we were doing the events almost quarterly and asked if they could sponsor Live from Tomorrow events for their developer ecosystem they were interested in reaching. Mm-hmm. I could not in good faith stay in my job and do this work. I was both not allowed to and my heart would have moved on, right?
Yeah.
So I resigned from Barclays, Dimitri resigned from Newark Venture Partners, and we launched a business that already had a check. Like the funny thing is like we got the sponsorship but didn't have a business to put it into. Mm-hmm. And we did this event and we partnered with Mashable. I was friendly with the business editor there and we live streamed it and it was great. And then a month later, Mashable sort of fell apart, like it wasn't the same company. And so that was sort of a loss. So we realized that maybe we won't be doing this variety show anymore. But some of the folks at IBM wanted to keep working with us. We wanted to develop original projects. We thought maybe the client revenue could offset original development. And then that led to, I can't believe I'm saying it, a 4-year relationship with IBM.
Yeah.
I literally made content for them. I made a talk show with them. I hosted live streams in New Orleans and Frankfurt and Las Vegas. We did a Live from Tomorrow show in San Francisco. We did a Live from Tomorrow show called Blockchain on Broadway in a giant Midtown theater. And over time, Live from Tomorrow became my favorite thing to do, but it certainly wasn't the thing that paid the bills.
Yeah.
Which is another thing that's sort of important for entrepreneurs. It was not the thing like, it was a really great creative outlet and we did make some money, but the thing that paid the bills was making client work. Yeah. And so two things happened in the sort of spring of 2019. One was the Blockchain on Broadway show was a very clear example of sketches with like a tight script, really talented comedians like folks from UCB and the tremendous band we had had written original music for it. And I had done a series of interviews that we don't really know what to do with. I know it's a weird thing to say, but like I'd done interviews like a couple of celebrities in this other event that I helped host, and we had access to the recordings. And so the thought was maybe Live from Tomorrow becomes a scripted podcast, like a very meta show, because we need to do something with all this content and sort of write around it. And so we saw what Blockchain on Broadway meant for people. It was like we're speaking so abstractly about it. I recommend people just go give it a listen. But basically what we decided, particularly myself and the incredible Ben Easton, who wrote much of the music for that show, and Mark Levy, who wrote the other, like all the other songs that Ben didn't write. They literally wrote half the show each. Yeah. And are brilliant. Their band is called the Academy Blues Project. They put out 3 terrific albums in 2021 alone. I recommend going to listen to them. And they're dear friends. The idea was to create an audio musical, like a scripted podcast out of these assets. And so we told this meta story of a guy named Matt Hooper quitting his job at a bank and starting a media company because it was exactly what I'd done the previous 2 years. And then the unusual experiences of interviewing famous people, but we did really weird stuff with it that I'm still fairly proud of. Like we'd burst into song, and my love interest in the show was a woman whose father was a coal miner who then became a crypto miner, so that no matter what he was doing, it was bad for the environment. But it was a nice opportunity to then talk about, the computing power necessary to mine Bitcoin and how it's ultimately very destructive, and to sort of examine what it's like to have two generations of the same family where one's a climate denier and one isn't. I mean, that was a really fun way to tackle some issues. The other reason I thought a podcast would be interesting was because I had been hosting, and I hosted 4 seasons of the IBM Blockchain Pulse podcast. And so I saw how our business audience that would come to Live from Tomorrow shows and listen to IBM Blockchain Pulse might be in the mood for something a little more entertaining, a little zanier. And that's sort of what happened. The pandemic hit. My dream of re-recording a lot of Live from Tomorrow, because I sing in it, and I'm not exactly a singer, to put it mildly. Like I wanted to re-record some of that show, and we didn't. We didn't have time. Obviously, the world sort of shut down. So what I then did was I made a second season that I'm more proud of the second season, if I'm honest. It was much better. And that was a much different version of the show. So Live from Tomorrow has 2 seasons. The first is a 5-episode musical. The second is a talk show, much like our live show, with sketches. But I got to work with the same band and the same cast, and they offered 2 entirely separate experiences. And it was just an absolute thrill the whole way through. And I stopped because I got tired. And I'm happy to talk about that. It's a weird thing to say, but it was it was way better download than I was expecting. Yeah. And it was a limited series at best. So I was sort of shocked that what started as 5 episodes in one season became a 15-episode second season. Yeah. And it was a thrilling experience, but it was not, it wasn't what made money in LFT Media. And it wasn't what, if I'm honest, it wasn't, the final product isn't really even what I kind of thought I would. I did really want to re-record that first season, and that does sort of gnaw at me still.
Bear Nation, once again, thank you for tuning in and listening to the Bear Necessities podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review. It really does help and means a lot to us, the show. And I want to thank our friends over at Fin. Fin is a social good platform that creates employee engagement and builds culture. It's our mission to support and give back to the communities that we serve around the world. And we do this by giving every guest on our show a $10 donation to the cause of their choosing using the Fin platform. Until next time, thank y'all, stay well, and rise up.